Welcome, welcome, welcome. Let's paint a fall fox with watercolor. It's about that time, you know. It's getting cooler outside. And in this little lesson, we are going to learn about some wet and wet techniques, a little bit of glazing, and how to make a nice texture for your fur. So welcome to Art with Viv. If we haven't met, I'm Viv, and let's just jump in and get started. Now I've got a nice gold green that I've mixed for his eye, and I am just painting around the edge. I've left a little bit of white for the highlight, and I also left the middle part white, and that's where our pupil is going to go. Then I mixed a nice light sort of beigey, reddish, yellowish, I don't know what color it is, but it's a nice light color, maybe a fawn color. That's what color it is. It's fawn, but I used a couple of mixes to do that. I wet the paper with that first really light mixture, and then I went in with a deeper, more orangey mixture while it was still wet. This is our wet on wet, and I just dropped that in there. Let it blend naturally. Now I'm doing a little bit more up around the ear. I also put a little shadow under his eye, a little bit of a shadow above his eye for his eyelid. And I'm just using the tip of the brush to blend it out. And I'm using my larger brush here because I want to cover more area faster, and so I want to use a bigger brush, and that's a good tip there. When you have a larger area, use a bigger brush, or you'll be in there just painting all day, and it could get streaky if you're using a smaller or too tiny brush. So I'm just working around. I'm looking at my reference photo. I'm deciding where the lights and darks are. That's very important if you want something to look three-dimensional, especially on a two-dimensional surface, which is what we are doing when we're painting. We are trying to make a flat surface look three-dimensional. We're trying to make the thing on our paper that we are painting look three-dimensional, and we do that through light and shadow. So I'm paying really close attention to where the shadows are on my reference. And while everything is still wet, I'm dropping that in there. I'm getting in those shadows. I've mixed a nice deep dark mixture for the ears. This little fox's ears are black, and I did not use a tube black. I used indigo and burnt umber for my black. And if you'll notice, part of the ear looks a little more brown because in my reference photo he had a little brown coloration in his ear. Even though it was black, it still had a little bit of a brown tint to it. And so I just did that by adding a little bit more burnt umber to the mixture. I used the same mixture for his nose, and I'm just going in there and painting the darkest parts of his nose first, and that's where his little nostril comes down in the very front part of his nose. I'm going to also put his eyeliner on. I think wild animals look so pretty when they have that black around their eye. It looks like eyeliner to me. It reminds me of the Egyptians a little bit. And I just love the way it makes their eyes stand out. So I always think of it as I'm putting on my little fox or whatever animal I'm painting. I'm putting on his makeup. Then once I do that, I have got a little bit of water, and I mixed it with that darker area, that darker blend. So it'll be a little bit watery, a little bit lighter, and put that on his nose. I put a little bit of light yellow inside of his ear, sort of a Naples yellow, a buttery yellow inside of his furry part on his ears. And then I put a little bit more darker color around the bottom part of his ear. And I'm coming back in. I've switched to my smaller brush because I'm going in for smaller little sections that I want to paint. And I'm just putting in some of those shadows that are darker. It's more of a rusty red, and I've mixed some orange in with some brown to get that nice rusty foxy color. And I am just putting in those shadows, and what I'm doing is I'm putting them on dry paper. That underpainting is dry now, and then I'm just blending it out with a little bit of clean water. Now I'm coming over to the back of his neck. I wet that with a little bit of clean water because I wanted that paint to flow across. It's wet and wet technique. And so I wet that with a little bit of clean water, and then I just dropped that darker rusty color in there. And now I'm coming along the edge while it's still wet and dropping in an even deeper brownish red color, sort of a really deep rust. And I'm I'm just getting in those little shadows where I see on the reference photo. And I've darkened around his eye. He has like a little line coming from his eye. I went really dark in that line. And now I am just blending it out, blending out those colors with the very tip of my brush. It's wet. It has plenty of water on it. So it's blending those colors out really nicely. And I've got his head almost looking like a cluster of triangles. That's okay. It's going to blend out as we add layers. And we let this dry first. We're going to add some more layers to it. That's called glazing. And that will also help us with some texture. We'll add a little bit more texture once some of these layers are dry. But right now I'm just trying to get in the lights and the darks. I'm sort of mapping those out. And I'm switching between my large brush and my small brush depending on what area I'm working on. So I'm putting his little smile in there, and I'm using that same color mixture that I used for the ears and the nose. I'm putting some of those little dots where his whiskers come out of the side of his little muzzle. I've got some blue shadows that I'm putting under his chin for his fur is white under his chin, and I'm going with some sort of grade blue shadows for that shadow. And I'm doing it directly onto dry paper, so that's wet on dry. We're doing several different techniques: wet on wet, wet on dry, glazing, and just sort of blending with our tip of our brush. Sort of a nice soft blend out in some areas. Right now I am just applying those shadows, and he is starting to look a little more 3D. Don't let his forehead bother you with the different triangles. We're going to fix that. Right now we're just focusing on his white muzzle and his white fur under his chin. We took that, just did like a pale gray, blue. Those are perfect colors for the shadow. And now I am just wetting with a really, really pale watery mix of that orange and just dabbing it on. I'm making sure that I go up into that white so that it looks like fur. I don't just do like a straight line like a box. You want it to be jiggity jaggedy like fur there. And I just went ahead and put his back. He's turned around, his back, looking sort of over his shoulder. So we put that in. Now I am taking this is dry. This is the dry area, and I'm just doing tiny little fur strokes, just tiny little fur strokes all through this little area, little tiny dots, some pointillism, and I am adding texture by doing this. Now that under layer is dry before I do this, or else these little dots will just melt into the painting and you won't have that texture that you are looking for. So now you start to see the triangles are going to start blending together the more texture we add. I'm also darkening some shadows. As you work, you want to compare each section to your other sections so that you can see if it's too light, too dark, if you need to go darker in an area. And you'll just continue to sort of judge those off of each other as you go through the painting. You're going to be looking and seeing, is this dark enough? Is it too light? Do I need to go darker? But be really careful, go dark slowly, because with watercolor, it's hard to lift it back out. It's hard to go lighter once you go dark, especially if you go really dark. Now, if you have non-staining colors, it's a lot easier to lift them. So, if you know your colors, you have non-staining colors, and then you can have a little bit more leeway with going a little bit darker, because you can always come back, wet that area, and lift it up. Now, as you see, I'm adding even more texture across his little forehead. It's starting to blend in those triangles. They're starting to sort of blend together. I'm adding a little bit more of that pale gray, really watery gray mix. And it's really just the mixture that I did for the ear and the nose with a lot of water added to it and just a tiny bit more blue than brown. So that's all that mixture is there. I'm getting in those shadows. I'm using my small brush because it's a small area. And once I get the color in, I'm just taking a clean wet brush, that tiny brush, and blending it around so that those edges are soft. And now I'm adding more texture. I'm making sure that I'm making my paint strokes go in the same direction that the fur grows. If you don't, it's not gonna look right. So we want it to look right, so we are conscious of how the fur is growing across the animal, what direction it's going, and that's the way that we're going to match our brush strokes. And again, I'm still using my tiny brush. I went between my big brush and my tiny brush throughout this. You really only need 2 brushes for this painting, like a size 8, and then this is a golden maple detail brush that I'm using here, and I can't see what size it is. Is it a 2? I can't tell. I'll write it in the comments just so you'll know what size brush that is. And I will also link to some of my favorite watercolor supplies if you're a beginner, so you can check those out and see if maybe you need to restock or start a new hobby. Watercolor, any art is good for the soul, but watercolor is a little more challenging, so might not be good for the beginning soul, although I think anybody can do it if they put their mind to it. So now I am still darkening up. I'm just keep layering and layering in some of these shadow areas with that deeper brownish red, that rust color. The fox is starting to really look more three-dimensional. He's coming to life. I think he's starting to look really good. Now I'm just taking sort of a pale golden yellowish orange, and I just did a little glaze over that. That helps blend those areas together. Plus I had that area a little bit too light for my liking, so I just put a little glaze over it. Now it's going to dry lighter than it looks right now, but it will help to start combining those edges a little better, and it just gets our tones right. Now I am just going straight into that fur on his back and shoulder, and I'm just doing all kinds of jiggity jaggedy marks to indicate fur. I'm letting some of that lighter color on the bottom shine through in some areas. I've darkened some of the areas around the white ruffle of his neck, and I'm just going in and adding a little bit more, just a little bit more color in some of those shaded areas. Just with the tip of my brush, it's really watery. I'm coming in with a deeper brown in some of the darker areas, and some of these areas are wet, so it's going to blend out really nicely. Some are dry, which will give me a nice crisp edge, which in some areas is what I want. So it kind of works out. You just have to judge the wetness and dryness of your paper and what finished result you want. If you want a soft blended result, your paper should be wet. If you want a crisp line, a crisp hard line, then paint on dry paper. That's how that works. Simple, easy things to remember as you're painting. How wet is your paper? How much wetness do you have on your brush? And those will determine the effects that you get. Now I'm darkening up some of his makeup. The line around the iris of his eye, I darken that up. Darkening up his little smile. I'm putting that a little bit darker in some areas, because it was sort of getting disappeared into all that shadow work I did, and I kept rubbing over it with the tip of the brush, so it sort of softened it up. So I just wanted to darken his smile up. Now I'm coming back into some of these areas that I want darker, even darker. Again, I'm glazing, layering. Every time I put a new layer, it gets a little bit darker in that area. You can even change colors with glazing. For instance, if I wanted that to look gray, I could put a green glaze, a glaze of green, and that area would look, it would dull that red down and give it a little bit of a green cast, and it would look like a shadow. Anytime you want shadows that, are more less saturated, then just add the complementary color. So now we're starting on the pumpkins, the little pumpkin design. I've painted that with a nice bright yellow first, and then I'm just coming back in with some orange. Notice how I'm getting darker in some of the creases, but I'm also leaving a little bit of that really pale yellow shining through. That's sort of like the reflection of how each section bulges out and it reflects on the next section. Even though there's a shadow, there's also a reflection right by the shadow. So you'll see some light and dark areas right in those creases where you would expect it to be all dark. But keep in mind, pumpkins are shiny and they do reflect their colors onto the opposite little sections that are right next to them. So that's why I left a little bit of those light areas right where the sections separate from each other, as well as some dark areas. We're going to do the same thing with this blue pumpkin. It's sort of a bluish green, and we're just putting that blue-green down first, a really pale watery wash, and then we're just going to come in with some darker blue while it's still wet. Again, notice how I'm leaving a little bit of a lighter area between the sections to be the reflection. Now you can do your pumpkins how you want to. This is just how I do my pumpkins. Everybody has their own style and their own way of doing it. This is just to show you the way I do it, give you a suggestion, but hopefully you branch out on your own and you start making your own techniques for the way that you like to paint. You get your own art vocabulary for the way that you like to paint certain subjects or objects. So again, we're going to make a blue pumpkin here. We're going with the wetty wet and really watery mix of the blue. And again, I'm going in there with some dark areas, some really pale areas, just to give it a little bit of dimension, getting those shadows in there. And now I am also leaving that little white reflective line between the sections of the pumpkin. I did not paint that middle section to touch all the way over to touch those two side sections. I left that little bit of lighter color in the middle. I mean, not in the middle, but on each side, so that it looks like a little reflection. But I'm also putting the darker shadows right beside of that light line. And I'm just blending that in with the tip of my brush. And I switched over to another brush. So that's 3 brushes we've used, but you don't really have to, you could use the small detail brush for this. I don't know why I switched over. I probably just grabbed it because it was on my table. So there are our little pumpkins. We're going to take some of that darker brown, put some little stems on them. Our pumpkins are going to have some brown stems. We're leaving a little bit of the white of the paper showing just for the highlight of those stems. And there we go. So now I'm just going to take some green. I've mixed up sort of an olivey green. You can use whatever color you have on your palette, of course, but I've mixed up 2 different greens to get sort of an olive green, and I'm just going to do some foliage around him. This isn't going to be a complete wreath around him, it's going to be a C. So I am just adding in all different kinds of foliage. Once I get the lighter color down, I'm going back with darker green in some of the shadow areas to give it a little bit of dimension. And that's really all there is to it. I'm not going to bore you with all of these little shapes because it's the same exact thing. You just start small at the tip of the leaf, and then at each leafette, or whatever they're called, as you come down, you just make them a little bit longer, a little bit wider, and then come back in there and drop in some darker green to add some dimension and shadows. And you can do your foliage or your leaves any way you want. You don't have to do the little ferns like I've done. You can do little tiny round leaves. You could change the color. You could make it a more blue-green, a more yellow-green. So it's really up to you. I encourage you to try different things, try different palettes. You don't have to copy everything I do. Just use this as a springboard. So now I've gotten in all of that foliage, as you see, and I'm darkening it in the pumpkins. And what I did was I went with a brighter blue and did a wash of a brighter blue over those pumpkins because they looked a little too gray for me. So that's all I'm doing here, is taking a little bit of a brighter blue and doing a really watery wash over those blue pumpkins, those blue-gray pumpkins, just to brighten them up some. Add some shadow to my orange pumpkin, give it a little bit more dimension. And really, we are getting close to finished, but I feel like there's not enough blue in there. We probably need to carry some of that blue color around, and I guess we're just going to have to make some little berries, some little dots. It doesn't have to be anything fancy, but once we get these pumpkins sorted out, then we can start thinking about how we're going to incorporate more of those that blue from the pumpkin in, just so that we'll have a more unified sort of painting at the end. Now you see I'm adding even deeper blue, but what I've done is I went into it's a deep blue, but it's not like how can I describe it? It's like an I can't even pronounce it. It's like an indifferent or an anthraquinone blue. And that's what I used. I did not use ultramarine blue. I used a deeper blue. So that's what I did to lighten up those pumpkins or liven up them. Now I'm just going to take that same blue mixture and just do little dots like little berries. It could be some berries. It could be whatever you want. I'm just doing some dots so that I can get that blue color throughout the painting and sort of unify everything and have a good mix of those colors all the way through the composition. I'm also adding a little bit more greenery. You can do this however you want to. Just fill it in. You can use whatever kind. You don't even have to put pumpkins. You could just use plain greenery and berries if you wanted. I just wanted the pumpkins because I am getting in the fall mood. If you saw my little fall hedgehog last week, then you know it's coming. Fall is coming. It's coming here. It is only 70 degrees here. It's been beautiful. So if it is nice where you live, I hope you are taking advantage of this nice weather, maybe sketching or painting outside. If you get a chance, I highly encourage you to sketch or paint or do something every day to feed your soul with art. So I'm just adding even more of these blueberries. They're not actually blueberries. They are berries that are blue. They're not blueberries. They're just decorative, and I'm just trying to get in more of that blue. Now they look really dark, but when they dry, they will dry lighter and they will look nice. Or I think they'll look nice. Now you could do red berries if you wanted. You don't have to do blue. You don't have to do blue pumpkins. You can do all orange pumpkins, or you could put apples there, or chestnuts, or acorns, or whatever thing that is fall, that says fall to you. That's the thing you should do. But I went with pumpkins. And I'm just going to add a few more clusters of these berries, and we are almost done. I just want to bring those throughout the composition, up and around, and that helps unify everything. It also gives it a little added texture and just a little more interest in there. I want it to be a little interesting. And of course, this is a pretty quick painting. These aren't meant to be like really deep tutorials. It's just to show you what you can do in about an hour. And of course, I've sped it up because nobody wants to be on YouTube for an hour watching how-to videos unless it's really something complicated. So I have sped it up, and there you go. You have a beautiful fall fox. You can tweak it however you want, and I appreciate you watching. Thank you so much. Now, if you've enjoyed this, please consider giving me a thumbs up, giving me a little comment what you might want me to paint next. Share it with a friend, subscribe, share this on your social medias so that other people can see it. That really helps my channel, and I appreciate it so much. All right, so I hope you have some happy painting, and I will see you again soon. Thanks for watching, everybody.